Hi guys, welcome to a video, and in today's video I'm just going to be reviewing A Sweet Sting of Salt by Rose Sutherland. If you're not familiar with this book, it follows a young woman who, when she uncovers a dark secret about her neighbour and his mysterious new wife, has to fight to keep herself and the woman she loves safe. This book is also a lesbian reimagining of the classic folktale The Selkie Wife, which, if you didn't know, is a traditional Scottish folklore about a man who steals a female Selkie's skin, forcing her to stay on land and become his wife. Unable to return to the sea without her skin, the Selkie longs for her true home, and while she may become a loving wife and mother, she will often be seen gazing longingly at the ocean, reminding her of her lost freedom. As a heads up, this video will contain spoilers, although since this book is a reimagining of The Selkie Wife, the biggest spoiler is kind of already out there. The lady, she's a seal. But either way, you have been warned. So to start with, I think a female written lesbian reimagining of a classic folktale, especially one with such prominent feminist themes and commentary, is an intriguing concept. And in regard to this, one of the most interesting aspects of A Sweet Sting of Salt is how it reframes the light in which certain characters and their actions are presented from the original tale. For example, in the original tale, the fisherman who holds his wife captive is described as a stubborn yet loving and kind husband, and his actions are framed in an almost sympathetic light, which downplays the insidiousness of them. Whereas in A Sweet Sting of Salt, the fisherman is presented in a much more sinister light and as an opportunistic predator, which is exactly what a man who keeps a woman against her will is. There's also a level of romanticization around the kidnapping in the original tale, with the captive Selkie falling in love with the fisherman and becoming a devoted wife and mother. Whilst in A Sweet Sting of Salt, Maureen doesn't eventually fall in love with Tobias and play happy families with him. She's very much portrayed as a captured creature who resents her husband, but obeys him because he possesses her key to freedom. The original tale holds very prominent commentary about how women have had their autonomy and freedom stripped from them by selfish men and the patriarchal system, and how that has trapped a lot of women in unhappy marriages and in a state of domestic slavery. And A Sweet Sting of Salt strips away all of that romanticization of captive domesticity and the bittersweet tone attached to the Selkie gaining her freedom from that captive domesticity in the original tale, and chooses to rework and portray those aspects through a more feminist and sobering lens. I also thought the ending of A Sweet Sting of Salt was interesting, as in the original tale, the Selkie gets her skin back and never returns to her husband on land. Whereas in the book, Maureen chooses to stay with Jean but comes and goes out to sea for stretches of time as she pleases, which places an emphasis on the fact that it's her choice to come back time and time again. And I thought that was a meaningful way to wrap a story about a female character who had lost her autonomy up. So for the most part, the feminist themes and commentary in this book are intelligent and thoughtful. And comparing this book to the original folktale it's based upon makes for interesting discussion. It gets book club points. However, unfortunately, I would describe the writing quality for this book as mediocre. It wasn't abysmal, but it wasn't great either. The writing quality starts out at an acceptable place, but I found that after a couple of chapters, it quickly deteriorated alongside the pacing, which left the book feeling like a low effort and rushed piece of work. I also don't know that Sutherland's simplistic and succinct style of writing worked all that well with the narrative and the gothic / horror elements of this book. For example, the main character Jean is a 19th century midwife. She's dealing with a lot of bodily fluids, pain, and female anatomy in quite an intimate way. But instead of the author using this as an opportunity to explore and emphasize the gory aspects of womanhood and female biology and underscore the very real dangers and consequences of childbirth during this period, which would have complemented both the feminist and historical elements as well as the darker themes of the book, she mostly sanitized and glossed over it, which felt frustrating and very surface level. And the fact that Jean is a midwife is both a significant aspect of her character and the plot, so I felt like it would have made more sense to to explore her experiences with helping women to give birth in a much more detailed and fulfilling way. And the fact that Jean is a midwife is also a significant aspect of her character and the plot. So I feel like it really would have benefited the book and made much more sense to explore her experiences with helping women to give birth in a much more detailed and fulfilling way. As I mentioned earlier, this book is quite dark and it certainly has an element of the gothic. So I feel as though it also would have benefited from a stronger development of atmosphere to accentuate or complement the gothic aspect of the book, as well as a better build-up of tension to make the various dynamics between the characters and the plot itself much more engaging. For example, the blossoming romance between Jean and Maureen is supposed to be incredibly precious, intense, brimming with tension and tinged with an element of danger. And yet it ultimately fell flat and felt underwhelming because the writing around their relationship was so superficial and rushed. I also think a greater build-up of tension between Jean and Tobias would have helped to portray the extreme sense of suspicion and paranoia that was consuming the both of them, and also would have intensified the precariousness of the situation, making it much more suspenseful and compelling. I thought Sutherland did a good job of introducing and interweaving elements of superstition and folklore into the story, and utilising things such as ghosts and burning ships to work as a foreshadowing, and at the same time enhance characterization and generally complement the mythical roots of this book. There's a strong theme of water running throughout A Sweet Sting of Salt, and as I'm sure most of you already know, water is often used as a metaphor for deep emotion, and I appreciate how Sutherland utilize the theme of water to symbolize the depth of Jean's feelings for other women. And alongside this, water is also symbolic of freedom, which further serves as commentary about Jean's repressed sexuality. But also, Maureen is parted from her freedom when she's parted from the sea, and interestingly, Jean's mother commits suicide by drowning herself, and although her reasons for doing this are never explored in depth, it's suggested that she committed suicide to free herself from the life she was living. So there's layers to the themes and symbolism. Sutherland also uses creatures such as a fox to build characterization. Our treatment of animals is often a reflection of our humanity, and where Jean treats the fox with kindness and tries to connect with it, Tobias wants to ensnare it and even suggests making a muff out of it, which portrays his lack of empathy for living creatures and how he views them for what he can get out of them, which parallels his treatment of women. So again, there is an element of thoughtfulness to the writing in that way. However, I feel like the author explicitly pointing out some of the themes and connections that she'd placed in this book to the reader suggested that she didn't trust the reader to make those connections themselves, which felt unnecessary and slightly infantilizing. I also found the writing around homosexuality in 19th century Nova Scotia inconsistent and somewhat sugar-coated. For example, Jean describes the townsfolk as keeping her at arm's length and being wary of her because of the rumours of her homosexuality that have circulated. But at the end of the book, all of that homophobia gets swept aside and Jean becomes a beloved and popular figure in the town, which felt contrived purely for the sake of giving the lesbian character a sugar-sweet sunshine and rainbows ending. And I understand the author's intentions with this, but I think within the context of this book being historical fiction, changing up previously established realistic aspects for the sake of happy feels a little juvenile and clashes with the more sobering and grittier elements of the book. The vibes are incohesive. And Jean and Maureen could have still lived quite happily together, as many real-life lesbian couples did historically, whether the local townsfolk accepted Jean socially or not. There's also a male homosexual couple, Laurie and Dow, who don't seem overly conscious about their homosexuality or romance, or even how it might look to others that they're living together in a cottage at the end. And even though I appreciate that this book is historical fiction, and the author didn't want to tie the gay characters to shame and despair, male homosexuality was illegal in this period, and there were serious social and legal consequences for men who were suspected or discovered as being homosexual. So even if Laurie and his mother didn't harbour any shame over it, I can't imagine there would be no anxiety or awkwardness around it whatsoever, considering that they are living in a Christian society which strongly condemns it. I mean, in fairness, Laurie is an Indigenous person, or at least he's part Indigenous. And even though he's living in a colonised Christian society, not all Indigenous people adopted a colonial Christian view of homosexuality, which could explain some of the writing, but even still, I feel like it would have been relevant and interesting if the book had explained and explored that in more depth, instead of once again just glossing over things. I thought the structure of the book and the plot itself was mostly fine. However, the rushed element of the writing made some of the character and story choices feel awkward and thoughtless. For example, when Jean goes to rescue Maureen from the cottage, I feel like she should have known, given Tobias's previous displays of extreme paranoia and suspicion, that there was a very high chance he would return home after pretending to leave for a fishing trip. So you'd think Jean's number one priority would be finding the box that Maureen needed and getting Maureen and the baby out of that cottage ASAP, not wasting time by playing a game of Sapphic Scrabble with Maureen instead. I think the author was going for the danger and excitement of that moment being such a turn on for the both of them that they couldn't resist. But considering the precariousness of the situation and what was at stake, it felt very oddly timed and like a stupid decision. I also thought it was really weird that Jean didn't give Maureen a chance to explain about the sealskin and instead just flew into a rage, despite never having displayed that kind of a temper before. It was such an abrasive switch up of character, and I could tell that it was placed in there purely to set up for the dramatic scene where Jean runs down to the shore and tries to rescue Maureen from the water because she's not yet aware that she's a selkie. And this is one of many examples in the book where the author was writing with the plot leading the characters and not the characters leading the plot. However, I think my biggest annoyance in this book is how Jean behaved like a sitting duck when it came to Tobias. His behaviour towards Jean became increasingly threatening and erratic. I mean, he's spying on her, he's hanging around outside her home, he shoots just past her with his gun, and he even kills one of her animals. The man was basically dropping hints that he was going to murder her, and yet never at any point did Jean think to get a rifle or any other weapon, set any kind of trap for him, or prepare for the worst in any other way than bolting her door and hoping for the best. Now, I understand that Tobias is a fully grown man, and I wasn't expecting Jean to physically girl boss fight with him, but throughout the book, Jean is consistently associated with and compared to a fox, and foxes are cunning and clever. So I feel like she could have formulated a more intelligent plan to outwit Tobias, rather than just helplessly watching and waiting around whilst he essentially terrorizes her. I get the feeling this is another example of the plot leading the character. I think the author wanted to set things up so that Maureen had the opportunity to be the hero, which gave her character something to do rather than just be the damsel in distress. But even still, I don't think it was necessary to dumb Jean down to that extent in order for that to happen. Furthermore, I felt it was incredibly idiotic that Jean went to knock on Tobias's door to see Maureen after he makes it clear to her that she's not welcome there anymore. I don't understand what she thought was going to happen. I mean, a lot of the explanations the author gave for some of Jean's choices were really weak, and it framed her as an incredibly naive and unaware character, which was frustrating. Overall, I would give this book 3 out of 5 stars. The positives are it's an interesting book to deconstruct through a feminist lens, and it contains a lesbian romance which doesn't end in tragedy. The negatives are, for the most part, the writing in this book is low quality and rushed, unfortunately making it a rather shallow and insipid read. Okay guys, if you've read A Sweet Sting of Salt, let me know what you thought of it down in the comments section below. Don't forget to subscribe for instant disappointment, and I'll see you guys soon. Bye!